you're ever sentenced to life imprisonment, chances are you'll be locked up here.
It is, in a sense, the English version of Alcatraz.
HMP Wakefield.
Biggest maximum security prison in the whole of Western Europe.
Here, you'll join the worst prisoners in British criminal history.
Weirdos, bad sex cases, rapists, serial killers.
You'd be in a cell next to the prison system's most violent inmates.
He's taken governors hostage, he's taken staff hostage, he's taken other prisoners hostage.
Or in solitary with a 4-time murderer.
He likes killing, and he will kill you.
Or you could even come face to face with child killers.
I've seen so many of them get stabbed, scalded, some occasions killed.
You'll be governed by the toughest screws.
If there wanted to be a problem, it was dealt with firmly.
Endure the harshest regime.
I felt that we were being psychologically murdered.
And you'll live with men who have no chance of being released.
The only way he's going to come out of jail is in a coffin.
This is the inside story.
I wanted to grab him and shake the daylights out of him.
From those who are incarcerated.
I was placed into a subterranean cage.
Those who work here.
If a prisoner can injure him in any way, shape or form, they will do it.
And those who know the truth.
He told me in a letter that given the chance, he would kill again.
Welcome to the place they call Monster Mansion. Welcome to HMP Wakefield, one of Her Majesty's Category A prisons. Tucked away off the M1 in a West Yorkshire city centre, this 400-year-old top security jail is arguably the worst place in Britain.
That's Wakefield Prison in all its glory. That's the place I worked for several years. Biggest maximum security prison in the whole of Western Europe.
It's an old Victorian prison, you know, extremely high walls, looks pretty austere.
It's very foreboding. If you walk round it, for example, it really does send a shiver down your spine because there's nothing. It's unrelentingly gloomy. It is, in a sense, the English version of Alcatraz.
And like in Alcatraz, sentenced to life here, you'll have been convicted of the most heinous of crimes.
Wakefield is known colloquially as the Monster Mansion. Its purpose to house the people that we fear as a society the most.
There was just over 700 prisoners in there. Vast majority of them were doing life. Incredibly dangerous inmates who weren't fit to be out.
You've got the so-called celebrity criminals. You've got Charles Bronson, Harold Shipman, Robert Maudsley. You've got the dregs of society.
Levi Belfield, killer of Millie Dowler and 2 other women. Jeremy Bamber, guilty of the White House Farm killings. Roy Whiting, the killer of Sarah Payne. I hesitate to use the word, but I sort of believe it. It's a dustbin, a warehouse for the worst. It is asked to house people we do not know what to do with and for which we have no other place to send them. And to some extent, Wakefield is the symbol of lock 'em up, throw away the key.
And keeping everyone locked up in here is the job of over 200 Wakefield screws. And they've got their work cut out.
In an establishment like that, a high security establishment, your first challenges are always about security and about keeping order. Especially when you consider that the prison is in a city centre, people aren't always keen to have a prison in their midst, so the public has to be reassured that these prisoners are not going to escape.
It is very, very secure prison. The walls, they're about 25 feet tall, and on the top of the walls, there's got an emplacement on which like an archway, which is hollow on the inside, and it's painted with a specific paint which doesn't basically dry. Behind that, you have razor wire, so it's virtually impossible for any inmate to get over that wall. It's never happened Since Wakefield has been a Cat A prison that any inmate has ever escaped.
There are 3 types of category A's. At the very top, you'll have exceptional risk category A's. That would be the likes of terrorists. Then you have high risk category A's, robbers, armed robbers, or gang bosses and people like that. And then you have standard category A, which is just that you've committed a very, very serious and possibly violent crime.
If you're being sent to a prison for Category A inmates like Wakefield, as soon as you're sentenced, it's in the van and on your way to do your time.
If you are a Category A prisoner, it's perfectly possible that you will be transferred under armed escort up the motorway to Wakefield Prison.
You get to the prison, then they take you out one by one, march you in through reception, where the cuffs are taken off.
You would expect to be searched, what in those days we called a strip search, now euphemistically known as a full search.
You have to squat to see if you've got anything up your bum.
They're given sterile clothing. They get told what's expected of them.
Then you'll be marched up onto the wing. You'll see all the people on your wing. They'll be shouting, screaming, people running about, and then everyone will look at you as you come in order to see who it is. Then you'll be shown your cell, you get a bit of water, close the cell door unless you've bailed up till the next morning.
And as you settle in for your first night, you'll most likely be bedding down in a cell near to one of the prison's most reviled criminals.
Wakefield has a particular reputation as a place which has an over-concentration of offenders or prisoners who in any other jail would have to be held in solitary confinement for their own protection.
It certainly has more, for want of a better word, dodgy Category A prisoners.
What prisoners refer to as nonces, or sex offenders, or people in prison for serious crimes against women and children.
Wakefield is where the word nonce for sex offender actually originated. What they used to do in the old days, the only way to distinguish for the staff who was a sex offender and was not to be opened with the rest of the prisoners was they had a slate board outside each cell with your name and number, and they would put the letters N-O-N-C-E, nonce, on it, which actually meant not on normal courtyard exercise. So when the staff came round to unlock everybody for exercise and let them out, when they see nonce on the door, they would leave them locked up, because they knew if they let them out, the other prisoners would attack them. So it became the universal word for sex offenders, well, certainly in Britain, it became nonce.
One of Britain's most notorious sex offenders serving life in Wakefield Prison is Roy Whiting, convicted of abducting and murdering 8-year-old Sarah Payne.
The image of Roy Whiting that always sticks in my mind is of this pale-faced, gaunt-looking man with lank hair who lived alone.
When Sarah went missing from a field in West Sussex, the entire nation came to a standstill.
The investigation into the disappearance of Sarah Payne is still officially a missing persons inquiry. But today, 12 days after the 8-year-old went missing here in Sussex, police gave their strongest indication yet that they believe she's been abducted.
Sarah's mum and dad begged for the safe return of their daughter as search teams scoured the countryside. But hope turned to despair when Sarah's body was found after an agonising 2-week wait for news.
As soon as Sarah disappeared, the police went to look for all those people on the sexual offenders register who lived in the region. And Whiting was, of course, one of them. He had a history of sex offences, a known paedophile.
Roy Whiting was sent to Wakefield Prison, where he's serving life with a minimum term of 40 years.
It was probably inevitable that Roy Whiting would be sent to Wakefield. He satisfied so many of the criteria. His crime was heinous, he was a sex offender, and he was also a convicted murderer.
When Whiting arrived at Wakefield, he soon found that he wasn't welcome.
Sex offenders and people who abuse women and children are hated far more deeply and irreconcilably in prison than they are out here in the wider community.
I've seen so many of them get stabbed, scalded, on some occasions killed.
He was in all the papers on the television, so he was well known. people take great offence with that, no matter what their own offences are.
Waking up on the wings at Wakefield, you'll be outnumbered by the majority of sex offenders in here, and they are hated by everyone.
Prisoners have got a code of ethics, and child murderers, paedophiles, they are looked on as the lowest form of life. If a prisoner can get to one of these and injure him in any way, shape or form, they will do it.
You might be surprised then to hear that despite this animosity, Wakefield locks up all its inmates together.
One of the more extraordinary elements of Wakefield is that sex offenders are allowed to mix on the wings with other offenders.
A lot of other prisons, you had your roughy toughies in there. Any sex offenders would have to be segregated, whereas in Wakefield they weren't. They were all on normal location up on the main wings.
Tensions on the mixed wings means you've got to keep your wits about you, and Wakefield screws must stay vigilant. Luckily, the prison's design helps them to keep order.
The radial design of the wings at Wakefield is a major aid to supervision.
It's a Victorian concept, and it was designed like a cartwheel shape. Each wing, A, B, C and D, are going off at an angle, like spokes on a cartwheel in the middle of a central hub. So one officer or several officers can see the end of the wing from the front of the spoke. So you're looking down maybe 80 yards down one way, and you can see right to the very end without having to go down it. And it works. It does work.
But with over 700 prisoners, there's only so much the screws can do. For a high-profile sex offender like Roy Whiting, it's as impossible to avoid the hate and abuse on the inside as it is on the outside.
More than 100 people gathered outside the court as Roy Whiting was driven away. Police struggled to keep the crowd from the van carrying him. A number of eggs and other missiles were thrown.
It's not simply in society as a whole that there will be an urge for vengeance against someone like Roy Whiting. Even in prison, and indeed in Wakefield, Whiting has been attacked on numerous occasions.
Roy Whiting has been violently assaulted by fellow inmates on 4 occasions. He was permanently scarred after being slashed in the face with razor blades and nearly blinded after being stabbed in the eyes with a sharpened toilet brush.
The most recent attack on Roy Whiting was when he was attacked by 2 fellow prisoners armed with weapons, including screws sticking out of wooden implements.
If you're a sex offender in prison, in top security prisons, you get very seriously hurt and on some occasions killed. People will come up to you in jail, you're on the land and they'll go, see him over there. You go, yeah, he's in a rape. And you go, is he? Oh. And the next thing you know, there's a lynch mob. I've seen it happen, I've done it myself. I've seen so many of them get stabbed, scalded. The things people do to other people in jail is horrific.
You get hot water, sugary water thrown over people, get boiling water thrown over them. They make all sorts of weapons out of the toothbrush handles with razor blades in the end of them.
There's a hierarchy in prison. I mean, I was an armed robber for 30-odd years. And in prison, they make you believe that you're top of the pecking order, you are somebody. But then, we're human. We need someone to look down on. Yes, I'm a scumbag criminal, but he's an even worse scumbag criminal. And the burglar who you're pointing at then goes, yes, I am, but that geezer over there robbed grannies who were coming out of the bingo. And then he'll go, but him over there, he's raped a 5-year-old and killed him. So that's the hierarchy. So you've always got to have somebody to look down on.
I was in the segregation unit at Parker, and in the cell next door to me was Ian Brady, the Moors murderer. And other prisoners who heard me conversing with him were enraged, absolutely enraged, and demanded to know why I was talking to this beast who should be hung, drawn and quartered. And I suppose what I found most shocking was that the very people imprisoned alongside me were expressing the views of most people on the outside. It was probably hang, draw and quarter them as well, regardless of the fact that they were in for armed robbery or shooting other gangsters or shooting policemen. We are all nonces as far as the ordinary community is concerned, understandably, I hasten to add.
Wakefield's inmates have their code, but the screws have to wrestle with their own conscience every day.
You are revolted by them. We had some seriously sick people who carried out horrendous crimes against kids. When I first went to Wakefield, there was one young man, his own kiddie, the kid had loads of broken bones, he had cigarette burns all over him, he circumcised him with a pair of nail clippers. I wanted to grab him and shake the daylights out of him. But you just got to be professional, you've got to step back, you've got to get yourself to toe the line, the right side of the line. You've got to make sure your staff do that as well. And it's not easy. In fact, it's incredibly difficult on occasions.
Some of the cognitive distortions that there were amongst the sex offenders were quite frightening. I'll give you an example that I heard from several prisoners convicted of incest. They thought it was okay to have sex with their daughters in order to teach them about it, you know, before anybody else did. And you had that kind of cognitive distortion thrown at you, which, you know, came as a surprise even to me the first time that I heard it. But all I can say is you have to be professional, and when you hang up your keys at night to go home, you have to forget about it and put it into a compartment marked work.
It ended for me a few years later when I actually attacked a supposed sex offender and then found out he was innocent. And after that, it kind of changed my outlook on them as well, because so many people had told me they were innocent over the years. I mean, even when you're beating people, when you're 6, 7-handed and you're beating them with bottles and batteries and pillowcases full of bars of soap, they're always screaming they're innocent. And I'm thinking, how many of them were? You know, who am I to be judge and jury and do this? And I just felt really bad about it. And I thought, I'm not doing it no more. And that was kind of the turnaround for me. After that, I started changing my life in jail.
Whichever wing you end up on at Wakefield, you'll be sharing with about 160 inmates, and many try to keep a low profile, serve out their sentence quietly, and get on with their daily routine.
If you're an inmate on normal location, you go into fairly overcrowded wings.
The cells are all single because it's top security.
You'll have a window, sometimes a window that doesn't open, sometimes a window that's got no pane of glass in it. And you'll have a table, an iron bed.
They had a picture board in there, they could put the photographs on there. Some of them decorated it. If they asked for painting quite often, they could, within reason, decorate their own cells.
It's not the most, it's not a hotel. It's not designed to be a hotel. It's there for what it's designed for. It's punishment, basically. But it's made as humane as possible.
They're unlocked in the mornings, they come down for the breakfast, and then the bell goes, and those that have been allocated workshops, off they go to work. Any convicted prisoner is expected to work. Once they're given a job, whatever pay they get, they can spend in the canteen and get their goodies. If they've got private cash, they can actually get stuff sent in. Argos catalogues get put round on the wings. They can actually buy stuff from Argos. From sort of 6 o'clock till 9, they're on free time.
You'd almost describe it as youth club stuff, pool table, table tennis and communal television. Match of the Day was recorded for the prisoners every Saturday night and was available for them to watch on a Sunday afternoon.
That's it, they have a normal life up there, as normal as you can get in a prison, apart from being locked up at night time.
But there's a wing where none of the normal creature comforts are available. If you misbehave, you'll be sent to Wakefield's notorious punishment block called F-Wing. Separated from the main prison, it punishes those who break the rules and segregates prisoners deemed too dangerous to mix with any other inmates.
Most prisons, the segregation unit is within the main prison complex. Wakefield was fundamentally different. The segregation unit was completely isolated physically from the rest of the prison. It was a prison within a prison. You have no interaction with a normal prison regime. You don't go to workshops, you don't go to the gym, you don't go to education. You're held within an isolation cell, which is usually very silent, very quiet, very isolated. So yeah, it's solitary confinement, basically.
Convicted of murder, Mark was sentenced to life and served 40 years in prison.
I arrived at Wakefield and was classified as one of the most unmanageable prisoners in the system. So I was placed into a subterranean cage, an underground cage, no natural light whatsoever. We were fed through the bars of our cage door. We were only unlocked for 1 hour per day to go onto a tiny enclosed exercise where we would be surrounded by about 6 members of staff and would only be exercised individually. They had a silence rule when I was there. You weren't allowed to try and communicate with prisoners in the cells around you. It was an inhuman environment. The prison staff who worked in the segregation unit at Wakefield had a very negative culture. There was an incredible degree of bullying, coercion and intimidation, and the staff thrived on it, basically. Some prisoners who were taken to what was called a strong box within F-Wing, which was a cell within a cell with absolutely nothing in it, it was a subterranean concrete box, would be thrown in there naked. And each day the staff would open the door and hurl a bucket of cold water over them and lock the door again. I found it incredibly amusing and hilarious.
Former prison officer Mick O'Hagan spent 21 years at Wakefield and became principal officer of F-Wing. He ensured there was no bullying or negative behaviour.
I was strict, I was firm, but I was very fair. I was good down there, I can say that, and so were my staff. We had a minimum of fuss down there. If they did what was expected of them, not a problem. But if they wanted to be a problem, it was dealt with firmly. Well, if an inmate assaulted an officer, he'd be controlled and restrained. It was 3-man teams going in and doing it. 1 man controlled the head, 2 men controlled each wrist, and they get taken to one of the punishment cells where there was nothing in there at all. It's very painful for the inmate, but you can't do them any damage. You really don't want it done to you very often. Can't break bones doing it. It was purely against the joints. You just bend the thumb back against the thing.
If sent to F-Wing, you'll join some of the most disruptive inmates in the prison system, and one who is deemed to be Wakefield's most dangerous.
There is one inmate who is segregated from his fellow prisoners, not so much for his protection, but for theirs.
F-Wing at Wakefield is a prison within a prison for the most unmanageable inmates. There were 2 underground cells in F-Wing, reserved for the most disruptive offenders. Ex-inmate Mark was placed in one, and his neighbour was a 4-time murderer so dangerous, he'd already killed 2 inmates inside the prison.
I was placed into the cell next door to a prisoner called Robert Maudsley. I'd heard about him before I got there, and I had this image of this almost demon-like creature, which is how the media portrayed him.
Referred to as Britain's most dangerous prisoner, Robert Maudsley has been locked up in solitary confinement for the last 45 years. In all this time, one of the very few people to have ever set eyes on Maudsley is his nephew, Gavin.
My name's Gavin Robert Maudsley. I was named after him. He's my dad's younger brother, my dad's his older brother, and that's my connection. I always knew I had an Uncle Bob, and I knew that he was in prison and that he'd done wrong, but I didn't really know the details of his crimes. And it was when I was in senior school, there was a double article in one of the newspapers. One of my friends was reading it and said, "Hey, Gav, is this Hannibal Maudsley, your uncle?" And there was a picture of him, and one of the other guys said, "Bleeding hell, he looks like you." And I knew straight away, I was going, that's my Uncle Bob. And it was only once I read that article that gave me an insight into what he'd actually done and how serious it actually was and stuff. That's a grey cloud that hangs over my family, if you like, you know.
Nicknamed Hannibal the Cannibal by the tabloids, Robert Maudsley committed his first murder in 1974 when he was working as a 21-year-old rent boy in London.
So the story as I first heard it, and this is in my uncle's own words because he told me this in a letter that he wrote me, Bob was abducted by a gang of paedophiles when he came to London. and they sexually abused him. And he swore revenge. He said he would hunt these guys down and he would take revenge on them. Luckily for them, he only managed to get one of them and kill one of them. But given the chance, he would have killed all of them. He handed himself into the police and he said, "Now will you help me? I need help." They put him in Broadmoor. In Broadmoor, it's my understanding that he wasn't given the treatment that he was still asking for, and him and another prisoner took a sexual offender into one of the rooms and they barricaded themselves in. And this was a 9-hour siege, and terrible things happened in that room on them 9 hours, you know. This guy was tortured, and the story goes that this is where they found a spoon hanging out of the victim's head, and that's where they tried to say my uncle's a cannibal, and that's where the cannibal Maudsley comes from.
The legend grew up that Maudsley had eaten the brains of the man with a spoon.
He did do an incredible amount of damage to the top of one of those victims' heads, so there was brains on view, apparently. But whether he actually took a spoon to it and ate it, Lord only knows.
What Maudsley had done was he'd finally killed the man using a sharpened plastic spoon, which he'd shoved into the man's ear. And so his nickname became Hannibal the Cannibal, and among other inmates, he was always known as Spoons. It wasn't based on reality, but the myth was forever associated with Robert Maudsley.
And now they sent him to Wakefield. They call this place the Monster Mansion. It's full of murders and rapists and nonsense. So what do you think's going to happen when you send them from there to Wakefield? Bad things. It doesn't take a genius to work that out.
Got sent to A-Wing, which in hindsight was not a good idea.
He's asking to be put on his own because he knows what can happen. At this point, everybody knows what can happen, to be honest. Put him on a wing, surrounded by rapists, paedophiles. So he wakes up one morning, and I know this because this is what he's told us. He was going to kill as many paedophiles as he could get his hands on that morning, but he only managed to get his hands on 2.
Walked down to the wing office on a Saturday lunchtime, dropped a lump of metal on the desk in front of the senior officer and said, "I've done 2 up on the 3s. And they went running up there and with 2 bodies. He'd taken almost the top of the head off one of them, and the other one had been stabbed all over the chest.
I'm not condoning what he did. He'd done very bad things, but I have to look at the other side of the coin and tell myself, well, he didn't kill no child, no woman, no innocent person left for work that day and didn't return home. The people he killed were really bad people. This is kind of glossed over in this story, I think.
As a serial killer, Maudsley was given a whole life sentence, meaning he will never be released from prison. When murderer Mark arrived at the underground cells in F-Wing, Maudsley had already lived in isolation for years.
I felt, literally, that we were being psychologically murdered, basically. So I had a straight choice, to conform and obey and suffer extreme mental illness and probably kill myself, or fight back. So I decided to fight back. While I was there and able to organise some degree of collective resistance, Bob became involved. During the demonstration at Wakefield, some of us stripped naked and covered our body in our own excrement because that would make staff reluctant to have any contact with us or to physically brutalise us. In fact, during a dirty protest, it almost becomes a form of empowerment to use your body waste to make life as unpleasant as possible for the prison officers. It becomes a weapon, and it's the only weapon you have, your own body waste. Robert hadn't been involved in any protest up until I arrived, and it actually had an incredibly dynamic, positive effect on his character and personality. He suddenly felt part of a human group. He was no longer totally isolated. And then one day, they brought in the riot squads, and every single one of us in the unit was transferred to other prisons overnight. They moved Bob as well, but unfortunately they took Bob back and placed him back into the underground cage, whereas I was very fortunate to move on and eventually find my way out of solitary confinement and finally out of prison eventually.
Robert Maudsley is kept in a perspex walled cell with a steel door. You have to go through 17 steel doors to get to Maudsley. He has his own dedicated team of prison officers. No one is allowed contact with him. He has to take what exercise he gets on his own. He lives in a box in which everything is constructed of cardboard, and he's been kept in that condition for many, many years. I would argue that it is a form of punishment that is extraordinary.
They did purpose-build that cell for him in 1983, and it's also said that that's where Thomas Harris took inspiration from for Silence of the Lambs, so that came out in 1991 it was. So again, that's also a bit of a thread to the Hannibal Lecter thing, not just the cannibal stuff, you know.
Maudsley's routine was pretty basic. He could come out for his hour exercise a day. For years, he didn't bother. He just used to be in his cell, listening to his radio, writing a few letters, reading a lot. He wasn't a great conversationalist anyway. Never went into any depth about it. I never asked him why he did what he did.
Maudsley's reputation and perceived risk to the staff affected the way Wakefield treated him.
For many years he was persecuted by the guards and stuff like that. They gave him a real rough time. And, you know, they would spit in his food and then slide his food through, so he wouldn't eat for months. They would hold back his tobacco, so he quit smoking. And that was the only thing he had. I said, "How did you quit smoking, Bob, when it was the only thing you had?" He said, "Well, that's the answer. It's the only thing I had, so it was the only thing he could take." So he said, "OK, well, fuck you. I don't smoke no more."
The system's treatment of Bob was totally dehumanising. To hold someone in an underground cage for over 40 years, I'm sorry, is unforgivable. What Bob did in terms of murdering sex offenders obviously was wrong. What the system has done to Bob is equally as bad. It amounts to psychological torture.
His conditions aren't great, but what are you going to do with him? You can't put him on normal location. They tried that, and he kills people. He kills them in Broadmoor as well. So that's not an option. So what do you do with him? I don't think there's any option but to keep him in those conditions. Severe they might be.
There are other ways of dealing with prisoners like Bob. They can be treated with some degree of humanity without the risk to anybody.
I don't think there's a limit to rehabilitation. Yes, you can rehabilitate some lifers. You certainly can. Serial killers? I don't think so. They actually enjoy what they do, and that's why they do it more than once. I mean, he's killed people on 3 separate occasions with a total of 4 people. There's a lot of... that takes some rehabilitating, that. He likes killing, and he will kill you, and I think he still would. I used to go in cells on my own, more than I should have done on occasion, but I would never go on Mosley's cell on my own. I would never ever go in there on my own.
Maudsley once put it himself when he said, "The prison service doesn't know what to do with me. They just want to put me out of their mind."
There's 2 options in my book. Keep him in the conditions he's in, or death penalty. People go, "Oh, not the death penalty, that's barbaric." Yes, I was killing 4 people.
Maudsley's whole life sentence is the most severe punishment in English law since the death penalty was abolished in 1969. It's a sentence currently bestowed on the 75 worst prisoners in Britain, and one of them is another Wakefield inmate, Jeremy Bamber.
Bamber was guilty in what was famously known as the White House Farm killings in Essex, of dispatching his adopted parents, his sister, and her 2 children in one bloody night, one massacre. And he was one of the first murderers to be effectively given a whole life term.
The only way he's going to come out of jail at the moment is in a coffin.
But refusing to accept a lifetime in prison, serial killer Bamber has become more well known for his fight to prove his innocence.
Bamber is nothing if not an active campaigner.
He was always appealing this and appealing that.
There are miscarriages of justice in jails, but Jeremy Bamber is not one of them. No.
HMP Wakefield is where serial killer Jeremy Bamber is currently serving his whole life sentence. So far, he spent 37 years in prison.
In a way, probably inevitable that Bamber should end up in Wakefield because he satisfies at least two of the principal criteria. He is the killer of children and he is a multiple killer. That makes him almost a perfect fit for Wakefield.
Journalist Eric Allison has been communicating with Bamber for over 10 years. He believes that he's innocent.
Until he was convicted of the murders at White House Farm, Jeremy had led a privileged life. He went to a private school. He's opinionated, there's no question about that. He's different from the average prisoner. Most people in prison are working class people. You know, they don't like him.
Jeremy Bamber, incredibly arrogant man. In his own book, he was vastly superior to all the inmates, all the staff. He was a cut above the rest. You know, he just strutted around the wing. That doesn't sit well with staff in Wakefield. Leading up to Christmas, one of the governor grades decided that sending down F-wing, and I was there to greet him. I said to him, right, what's your name? And he looked at me, as I say, well, surely you should know my name. Of course I knew his name. I knew very well who it was. So he said, my name is Bamber. I said, oh, and what sentence are you doing? He said, life times 5. I said, life times 5? I said, who did you kill? He said, I killed 5 members of my family. So I looked at him and said, oh, think of the money you saved at Christmas. And the look on his face, he just head dropped. And all my staff were looking at me like this, and cut his legs straight out from underneath. Oh, that's the Wakefield way. Cut the legs out. Don't do arrogance.
Through his letters and calls with Bamber, Eric Allison has formed a completely different view of him.
He's a model prisoner. He conducts himself well in prison. He's good-natured. He gets on with staff and inmates. He's worked in a shop that provides instrument for Braille. You know, Jeremy's a man who cares about people.
Outside of his daily prison duties, Bamber has devoted the rest of his time inside to fighting to overturn his conviction.
Bamber is nothing if not an active campaigner, even though he is in Wakefield, is one of the only prisoners with a whole life term to continue to maintain his innocence throughout.
From day one, he's turned himself into an expert, if you like, and he studied, literally, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. In his cell, no laptop, no internet, you know, no facilities.
He managed to rub people up the wrong way all the time, staff mainly. Governor grades quite often, because he was always appealing this and appealing that.
Bamber is currently waiting on the outcome of his 6th application for an appeal since he was first convicted in 1985.
I know that I was outside with the police when they saw someone moving around in the house, when they were talking to someone inside the house, when they saw my sister in the kitchen, when they went into the house. And so not only do I know I didn't murder my family, but I know that they know I didn't murder my family.
This time, I'm sure it's different. The evidence now overwhelmingly points towards his innocence. I'm aware that there are people who are convinced of his guilt and therefore convinced that he's where he should be.
Bamber's as guilty as sin, everybody knows that. You know, I was in jail with the guy. I was on a wing with him. I know how sneaky and manipulative that man can be. Think about this. If you're Jeremy Bamber, yeah, and you're never, ever, ever getting out, what are you going to spend your life doing? Trying to convince people you're innocent so you can get out. You know, that's what you do in prison. And I've seen it done a million times, and I've done it myself. You look through all your statements a couple of years after the case and you go, Oh my God, if I'd have said that in court, it might have been different because they put the wrong number on that document. Clutching at straws. You've had your trial, you've had your appeal. You know, there are miscarriages of justice in jail. Seriously, there are, but Jeremy Bamber is not one of them.
Another of Wakefield's inmates campaigning for his release is Charles Bronson. He's one of Britain's longest-serving prisoners, and in exclusive calls from inside, he offers first-hand insight of his time there.
In the last 46 years, I've probably spent 20 years in Wakefield Prison. When you first went in the cages, it was cold in there, dark, gloomy. There was 4 sets of bars on the windows stopping the air coming through. There was a cage outside the window, cage on the door, cardboard furniture, cardboard table, cardboard chair, a piss pot, jug of water. If you got a library book, you was lucky.
Principal Officer Mick O'Hagan was tasked with locking up Bronson.
Stanley Bronson came to Wakefield with a horrendous record of violence. To say he had a bad track record would be an understatement. I think he'd been kicking off in virtually every prison he'd been in at that stage, smashing places up, running amok, covered himself in butter so staff couldn't get hold of him, just violence.
In the past, he's taken governors hostage, he's taken staff hostage, he's taken other prisoners hostage. He's in isolation 23 hours a day, locked in a concrete box, and while he's in there, he can't do any damage.
Sentenced to 7 years in 1974 for armed robbery, Bronson's still in prison because he's carried out 9 rooftop protests, attacked over 20 prison officers, taken inmates and staff hostage, and claims to have caused the prison service millions of pounds worth of damage due to his unpredictable violent outbursts.
We were very cautious of him, yeah. When he first arrived, he turned up at Wakefield in a shell suit and a body belt, and I thought, he's really not going to like what I'm going to tell him now, so we half expected it to go badly right from the off. I said to him, you can get that off. And he said, well, I said, that shell suit, you're not wearing that in Wakefield Prison. And he said, well, this is what I wear. I said, not in here, you don't. You wear prison-issue clothes in Wakefield, there's no exceptions. And he sort of gave me the look, and I thought, oh, here we go. And I said, well, because you're not conforming, that entitles you to nothing while you're here. I said, you'll get no visits, you'll get no exercise. And we really, all of us expected, we were all in the starting blocks, thought, he's going to go. And I said, if you come to me a bit, I'll come to you a bit. I said, I don't do that very often. I said, you're a keep fit fanatic. I said, you wear prison issue overalls and I'll put you out on the exercise yard for an hour a day. And he sort of thought about it for a bit and said, yeah, okay. So that was the first coming together, as it was.
I'll never forget, I just arrived there. I've just taken Governor Wallace hostage. And I've arrived in Wakefield, Monster Mansion. I've got a broken jaw, a couple of broken fingers, 2 black eyes, a discolorated nose. I'm in a terrible mess. So they slung me in the cage, and a couple of days later, Mick O'Hagan's come to my door.
I thought, I'm going to try something here. And I've been asked many times why, because he was probably the most unlikeliest prisoner in the prison system to try it with. And I opened the outer door and said, you've been in solitary for 21 years. I said, don't you want to get out? He said, well, of course I do. I said, well, you're going the wrong way about it, aren't you? All this kicking off and assaults and hostage taking. I said, when you start using your loaf. And I said, start boxing clever.
Oh, he says, you're never going to get out, mate. They will never free you. He said, why don't you do something positive and creative? I said, what? What? He said, writing, poetry, art.
So the next day I took a sketch pad and some coloured pencils and stuff down. And I said, see what you make of that. He said, I can't effing draw. I said, well, if it's no good to you, forget it. I said, but just see you get on. 2 days later, he showed me this piece of work, first thing he ever did. And he said, what do you think? I said, I thought you couldn't draw. He said, I didn't know I could. And it took over his life. He sat all day long at his little table. He's doing all this stuff.
I've now got 19 published books. I've won 11 Costumer Awards for my art and my poetry. When I got locked up in 1974, it was for a pump-action shotgun, 12 bore, sawn off. And I've got rid of that now, and now I've got a sawn-off paintbrush. So really speaking, it was down to Mick O'Hagan that I really, you know, become a better person.
There was a mutual respect going on. He's the only prisoner I've ever done anything like that with. And it paid dividends as far as we could. None of my staff ever got assaulted by him. It's about the only prison he's never kicked off in.
While in F-Wing, Bronson became Robert Maudsley's next-door neighbour in the underground cells.
The two original cages, what me and Bob was in, inside the cell, you've actually got a 2-inch piece of glass.
There was a gap between the two. They could actually see each other, they could converse. There was a television in the middle. They could choose what programmes went on.
But we always used to end up arguing because Bob would want to watch Emmerdale and I'd want to watch Coronation Street and things like that. Bob would want to watch something else and we was arguing all the fucking time, mate.
On one occasion while watching TV, Bronson made a discovery he didn't expect.
I did a TV series several years ago called Confessions of the Paparazzi, and Charlie was watching the programme in his cell, and he recognised my name, George Bamber, and he had me invited over to the prison to go and visit him. So I went to the prison on a visit on the assumption that he just liked my antics on this TV show. So I got to the first gate, and as I walked in, I got into F-Wing. They've opened a door, I've walked in, and then I've just looked, and there's a wall in front of me, and there's a hole in the middle with loads of bars in it. I've looked through the bars, and there's a bloke stood there opposite me, and he went, "All right, son, nice to meet you, I'm Charlie."
What happened next was to change George's life forever.
Kept talking, joking, and got on really well. And before we left the first visit that we had, he opened half a sandwich that I had left and he spat inside the sandwich and closed the sandwich. And he got a bit of hair from his tash, put it into a handkerchief, put it on top of the sandwich and said, "Take that with you." And when I got home, I got a phone call. It was Charlie. And he went, "You know that thing I gave you today? You need to get it tested." And I actually thought that they were poisoning him or they were doing something to him. But then he told me that I needed to get it tested because he thought I was his son. So I swabbed his saliva and then I swabbed inside my mouth, whatever, sent it all off. And then I got a thing back a few days later and it just come in, Charles Salvador, George Bamber, like father, 99.98% match.
Unlike serial killers, Maudsley and Bamber, Bronson is eligible for parole, but he's been refused time and time again.
Charlie spent 48 years in prison. 30 plus of that is spent in solitary isolation. He's not any problem to anyone, doesn't cause any problems to the staff. He gets on with his artwork, he eats his dinner, he goes out a day, every day for an hour, does his press-ups and his sit-ups. To be fair, he's rehabilitated himself. The question is, why is Charles Bronson still in prison? If I spoke to someone down the road and said, Charles Bronson, they'd go, "Oh, that guy that's murdered 15 people." And I'd go, "What? No, that's not Charles Bronson, that's Charles Manson." That's what everyone confuses him with.
Makes no sense to me. You hear about some of the other stuff that's going on, and we've had the pitchfork thing. Brutally murdered 2 15-year-old lasses. Got released. No. Did Charlie kill anybody? No. 46 years.
But for the first time in years, things might be different.
I once had a plane fly over there with a flag, "Free Bronson."
Around Bronson, there's this huge sort of industry almost. There are petitions to free Bronson. You know, he's got a chance here. He might get out.
What we did was take on the judicial system and try and get Charlie in front of a judge. I think Charlie now has got the best possible chance of ever being released.
But not everyone is so sure.
I think to myself, why are you wasting your time? They're not able to release him. Because Charlie, the prison system and the press have built him up as this huge, big ogre and monster that the public would go, oh, hold on a minute, you know, I mean, releasing him, what's going on here?
After almost 50 years in prison, one of Britain's longest-serving prisoners, Charles Bronson, has high hopes for his upcoming 7th attempt at parole.
Oh, I've had hundreds of people outside that wall doing protests for me, you know. I once had a plane fly over there with a flag to free Bronson.
What we did was take on the judicial system and actually try and get Charlie in front of a judge, not 3 people from the parole board. As soon as he heard the name, decline, decline, decline. Fortunately, we actually won the case. And now, next year, Charlie's parole is going to be heard in a courtroom. I think Charlie now has got the best possible chance of ever being released.
But even though Bronson hasn't killed anyone, will this new approach make a difference?
It's very difficult for anyone in authority, whether it's the courts or the Home Secretary or the prison authorities, you know, who's going to make that decision? Who's going to say, we're prepared to take that risk? I mean, who is going to decide to take that risk? It's, you know, if that goes wrong, that's a hell of a responsibility.
Unfortunately, and it's a really sad thing, I think he's going to end up like Reg Cray, his mate, who, when he's like old enough and infirm enough not to even walk on the street, they'll suddenly give him a blessing and let him out. Oh, look at us, we'll let you out because you're about to die next week. And that's what the prison system do with people like that.
I don't want to think about him not getting out of prison. When he gets out, all he wants to do is find a nice little cottage down in Devon near us where we can keep an eye on him, away from the city, away from all the idiots, away from all these plastic gangsters and all the rest of it. And he just wants to do his artwork. You're going to get 2 dogs and call them Ron and Reg after his 2 mates in prison. And we always say the same thing. We're going straight down to the nearest cafe and having the biggest fry-up we possibly can.
Bronson is now 69. This could be his last chance of parole. If it gets denied, prison, his home for the last 48 years, could be where he remains to the end of his days. Alongside Whiting, now aged 63, Bamber, aged 61, and Maudsley, aged 68, Wakefield now has another role to play. An old people's home for ageing inmates.
With someone like Robert Mosley, he's never coming out again. There's no chance of him ever coming out. It really is a case of risk management. You need to house him somewhere. You need to contain him.
In my humble opinion, we can't do what Adolf Hitler did. We can't just throw them away and throw away the key. With people like that, you have got to lock them up, yeah, but you've still got to give them some quality of life. They're not animals. You've got to treat them as human beings.
Private letters written to nephew Gavin reveal for the first time how Wakefield's incarceration of Robert Maudsley is no longer as bad as we've been led to believe.
People would be shocked to read those letters, actually. In one of his letters, he's given me an example of, like, his daily routine. He watches his TV. He listens to music on his music system. He's got a PlayStation 2. He plays his video games. He could play that for 24/7 if he wanted, but he doesn't. He goes to bed at like 10 p.m. I think he told me he goes to bed.
For Robert Maudsley, Wakefield Prison is his home. Other than the screws, the only contact he has with people is with his family on their occasional visits.
We have to get him his banana milk. That's his favourite drink. We'll get him his banana milk and several chocolate bars and normally like a sausage roll or something. He'll bring a flask of hot water with him and some tea bags, so he'll make us a cup of tea. He likes to complain that I eat his chocolate bars, but I already tell him, Bob, I've compensated for this and bought double, you know? We go in there and it's all banter and having a laugh and taking a piss and who's going to get it this month, you know? Who should we send to that now? Will it be Uncle Kevin, me dad, Uncle Bob? Time for crying and doom and gloom. That was so long ago, I bleeding forget about it, you know? For me, personally, I'm trying to move the grey cloud that's been hanging over the family and no, it's not as bad as what people are making out, you know. You know, Wakefield used to be his hell, But now it's settled down and he's comfortable and he's treated as a human being. He knows he's on a whole life tariff, and he's told me he will serve out that sentence to the best of his ability because he knows what he done was a terrible thing. He never tries to justify it in the way I justify it. He's in his safe space, and that probably sounds crazy to a lot of people because solitary confinement in Wakefield Prison isn't a safe space for many people. But for him, that's his safe space. He told me in a letter that given the chance, he would kill again. And I believe that.
From custody suite to control room, we go behind the scenes of Lincolnshire's busiest nick. A new series of Inside the Force 24/7 begins next Monday at 9. Unravelling an investigation that became an international manhunt, getting away with murder, the killing of Mary Goff is brand new tomorrow at 10. Next tonight, Casualty 24/7, every second counts.